And I loved the demon chicken. I probably loved the demon chicken a little bit too much. I quite like chickens. Today I want to talk about Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. Content warning for SA, miscarriages and birth trauma. Let's get started. I thought Nettle and Bone was an adult book when I first picked it up, because that was where it was categorised, either in the bookshop or online. Can't quite remember now. But I've also seen a lot of people refer to it as a young adult title. I think it's important to know that in this book there are a lot of adult themes, such as childbirth and the decision whether you want to have children or not. These things are more relevant to adults rather than young adults, but there's nothing in this book that young adults can't handle. It does make me want to talk slightly about age categories, though. For a lot of readers to feel that a book is adult fantasy rather than young adult, it seems to have to cross this line into the really gritty, heavy political, or very explicit. But I'm an adult and I don't need those things to enjoy a book. It's why I still enjoy young adult, but I think you can still have some older themes and older issues and call it adult fantasy without those things. And this is a book without those things, basically. I find that when you go into new adult, it starts becoming something slightly different, which isn't what I want. I just want young adult that also covers themes that I, as an adult, have experienced that young adults won't. Mara is 30. She's making decisions about children. She's making decisions about her body. And she's sort of breaking away from her first sort of job, really. She's already broken away from her family, which would be the kind of young adult category. Now she's actually working in a nunnery, and she's breaking away from that to help her sister. A sister that she doesn't particularly like that much, but she still knows, family's important. She's heading out and she's trying to help. To me, this doesn't really fall into the typical YA tropes. It's not angsty, and the romance isn't all-consuming, which young adult fantasy tends to have all-consuming romances, whereas this isn't. This is a very actually realistic romance that's in this book. So it's actually quite mature. But I've classed it as young adult romance because my video editing software online that I was using before I had a baby decided that after 3 months it would just delete everything that was on there. So I've actually lost my intro. So seeing as other people are grouping this together with young adult, I'm just going to do the same. So the plot. I might just read what I've written for this. After watching her two older sisters suffer at the hand of a prince, Mara realises no one's going to save them. The timeline... Oh, no, that's the next bit. So, she decides to enlist the help of a grumpy witch, a demon chicken, a fallen warrior, a bone dog, a fairy godmother to break the spell, protecting the prince and save her family from his clutches. I found it tried to shake me off in the beginning. The timeline sort of hops around in a way that's really confusing, and it's really hard to sort of ground yourself in what the novel is about. The only reason I could sort of tell for the author choosing to do it this way is to hide the slightly slow start. But I didn't think it was really done very well. I kind of liked this book despite how it was structured. It also contributed to what I think is quite a misleading opening. The opening is quite dark and quite creepy, and you have this woman who's stitching together these bones while her fingers are bleeding, and she doesn't think she's going to survive, and it's a very corruption is everywhere in the land, and it kind of prepares you for what feels like a horror novel, except for it's not a horror novel. It's actually quite a whimsical fantasy tale. I promise. I know these things don't sound like they go together, and honestly they didn't, but this is actually kind of a whimsical tale. I kind of feel like maybe it was done for aesthetic reasons, because horror is actually really popular at the moment. So to lead with the horror is to sort of help sell the book. But that might just be the cynical writer in me thinking this. But yeah, this is a whimsical tale, I promise. The reasons why these things aren't good from a analytical point of view is because of expectations. You're luring the author in with promises of this scary, creepy story. There are cannibals, there's blood, and it's all very and a bone dog that's risen, a bit zombie-like. It feels very, it feels very one way. And then you take them on a sort of cozy meander through a magical fairy tale kingdom. It just changes the expectations. I was sort of in the mood for a bit of horror, even though I don't always like horror. I was kind of in the mood for it, which is why I picked up this book. And then it took me on a very different adventure. So while I still enjoyed that adventure, I felt like I didn't choose to be a part of it. I just sort of got dragged into this almost cozy fantasy. So from a writer's point of view, I'm thinking that's not a great thing to do. Yeah, it might help sell more books, but I think it's going to contribute to that feeling that this book isn't quite 5 stars, even though it feels like a fantastic book. But I liked it. And I liked the humour in it, and I feel like more books need to do humour. It also has quite a straightforward linear plot, just don't let that opening fool you. After it jumps around with kind of no markers about when it's jumped around, you sort of have to work it out later. It's a bit weird. But after you get past that, it's actually quite a linear, easy to understand story. So if you are struggling with the beginning, I would say just push through, and you might really enjoy it. If you really loved the beginning, however, it might actually not be the book for you. The main character, Mara, I actually related to her pretty hard. I found her self-deprecating, quite funny. I found her to think about things quite practically, but also with a little bit of like quirkiness. And she's worrying about certain things that I feel like other writers sort of miss because they're not putting themselves fully in the character. But I felt like she was fully in the moment with the way that she was sort of thinking through the problems. It just felt very realistic. I later found out by watching some other people's reviews to see, what other people sort of thought of it, that Mara is actually a very anxious character. And then I felt a little bit attacked because everyone was saying how massively anxious she is and how obvious she's, how obviously that she is very anxious. Whereas I just thought she was just very honest and relatable. But that it kind of checks though. So moving on. My main gripe with the lead character is that she starts out very strong. She starts out very strong and independent. She knows that no one's going to save her sister, so she goes off and she decides that she is going to save her sister. She's told to sit back in a nunnery, and she's having none of it. She's going to go for it. And she manages to pull things together, even though that she doesn't feel like she can do it. The only problem is she starts pulling in all these other characters, and slowly, one by one, they sort of steal the conflict resolutions. And this means that the more characters we get, the more passive Mara becomes. Instead of being a very strong person who gets stronger as she goes along, she actually sort of becomes weaker because she sits back and lets everyone else deal with it. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely loved all of the other characters. It's hard to pick a favourite. It's probably Agnes, but I mean, which is the fairy godmother who's a bit... she's just really nice and just trying to do the best job she can and just wants to, not harm anybody. But her magic is better when it takes a darker edge, but she doesn't like that, and she's just very nice. And she bounces quite well off of the Dust Wife, who is the sort of grumpy witch who sort of says it how it is and doesn't put up with any nonsense. So those two bounce off each other really well, and I absolutely loved them. I also quite liked Ferris. I liked the guy in it as well. You know, all of them have really strong characters, strong motives, and because their personalities are so strong, it just works really well. But like I said, Mara fades away. She becomes more passive. The others step up to the plate and they solve most of the conflicts. And it just takes something away from her. It gets to the point where the main climax of the book, Mara doesn't really do that much. She sort of just watches in a lot of ways. And I think this could have been written slightly better, because if Mara was thinking about how she had pulled together all of these different things on all these different people and how she had contributed and how they're unraveling, but she still has sort of agency over the decisions in a way because she helped organise it and orchestrate it. If she had felt like an orchestra in that conductor of an orchestra in that moment, then it would have felt a lot more powerful. Instead, the anxiety side of Mara came out and she was watching everything and worried about it and being very passive in the biggest moment of the book. This is not great because we as readers generally want to see the main character succeed in some way. And even if that means that she's not physically doing anything, if she's just sort of conducting, that's still fine, but it's got to feel that way. And if it doesn't, then you leave it the main moment coming across a little bit anticlimactic. I also found a lot of the resolutions throughout the book in general were a little bit too easy. It did feel a little bit like a video game like Zelda, where you acquire a new power, like you acquire your sword and shield, and now you can go into the forest. It did feel a little bit too easy in places. For example, when they're down in the crypts, the Dust Witch uses her magic to be able to progress the story along. There's not really a big struggle, or there's not some sort of like clever thing that Mara's sort of like put together. She hasn't like learned things along the way and then used those things to help her in the moment that matters. She sort of just does them. No, that's not right. She sort of just watches the others solve the problems. On to the romance. I quite liked the romance, although I also didn't care about the romance. That might seem like a contradictory statement, but just let me explain. I found that the romance felt very real. It was almost understated in a way. They catch eyes, they look at each other, they kind of like each other, but it's not the main point of the book, and it's not all consuming, and it doesn't really fall into a trope. I guess you could say there was the trope of like two people, one bed, and things like that, but it didn't feel like this is a YA trope being used. It just felt like this makes sense for the situation that they're in the book in a way, and they just felt like real people progressing on their journey and sort of falling in love. It was a very mature sort of romance and it felt very real, and I quite liked that because I don't think all romances need to be so dramatic. But I also, if it wasn't in there, I don't think I would really care that much. So if you're the kind of person who needs a romance in a book to enjoy it, you might find that this book actually doesn't really offer that, because there is romance, but it doesn't really give you that kind of same draw that other romances give. I don't need romance in a book to enjoy it, so I didn't mind that it didn't give me those sort of feels. I also loved that this book was a standalone. I absolutely loved that it's a standalone. We're not dragging this out for 3 books. We've got a whole story all in one. In that sense, it felt quite satisfying. I also think the author did a really good job of making it into a very accessible standalone to get into. The place names are simple. I think some people said they're a bit too simple, but I think they're exactly what you need. You know the Harbour Kingdom, you know what that is. You don't need a whole 3-page description of this place. You don't need its history, because quite frankly, you don't care about its history. It's not really that important. I think the place still felt quite real. Hang on, need to remember what I think. Yeah, I think the place felt quite real, and it used terms that I could pronounce in my head, which I was very grateful for. And it made way for sort of for banter and for enjoyment and for quirkiness, and it made way for the story to just be fun and enjoyable. You don't need to know all the surrounding lore because everything is quite intuitive. It's the kind of fantasy I quite like. Also, a lot of the stuff inside this book had great standalone appeal. There is a very creepy bit with a puppet in it, and I'll just say that the bit with the puppet could have been stretched out into a 2010 trilogy alone. Oh, and I loved the demon chicken. I probably loved the demon chicken a little bit too much. I quite like chickens. Okay. I think I liked the demon chicken maybe a little bit too much because I wanted it to do more, and it actually didn't have that big a part to play. I feel like maybe it's just me thinking this and not everybody else, but I would have given more spotlight on that chicken. Yeah, they were hilarious, and I wanted to see a slightly bigger payoff with the chicken. But I guess this is a standalone, and there were a lot of grey characters, so to give them all their spotlight it would have been quite difficult. I guess the chicken did enough. Right, moving on to the ending. I've talked about the ending a little bit, but I'll just go over it in a bit more detail. I felt like the ending was a little bit too easy. There weren't really many hurdles to overcome. It was more like a straight walk to the finish line. From a certain point, you sort of know what's going to happen, and then it happens exactly how I thought it was going to happen. And I know that when you're writing a book, people say that you should make sure that your ending does make sense, that somebody could take the reins and write the ending. But I felt this one was a little bit too easy. I wanted some surprises, some little twist. More than anything, I wanted Mara to show something that she had learned throughout the book from all of her friends that she had gathered. I wanted her to take whatever she had learned and then just made it something in the ending. And that really didn't happen. The others just sort of dealt with the problems while she was present. And do you know what? It's kind of funny going back and looking at other people's reviews for this book as well, because when they start talking about the beginning bit, just straight after you finish the ending, it sort of made me realise that I had forgotten so much that happened in the beginning because none of it was relevant. I didn't need to remember it, and it just felt like an entirely different book. It just seems like a very odd choice. And I'm wondering if more could have been done to give the book better continuity, just from the general feels and vibes. Maybe there was some stuff in the beginning that should have actually come through towards the end a little bit more. But this is also like a really prolific author who, I guess what holds me back from giving this book 5 stars, I know I've talked about it critically the whole time, but that's because some books make me think a lot and I like it. It's not necessarily indicative of a book being really, really bad. This is a really, really good book in my opinion. But what made me really hold back is that payoff. It felt like I didn't get a payoff. I wanted to see, like I think I've said maybe too many times now, I wanted to see Mara putting together all that she had learned to feel in control for a moment. But this is an imaginative, dark in places, whimsical in others, humorous book, and I really loved it. I love that I have read it, all one book of it, and I have an entire fully fleshed out story with excellent characters that I want to continue thinking about. But we won't continue. We will not write more. And I'm really happy that I chose to read this book because I'm not someone who likes horror. So it was a bit on the edge for me, but it wasn't horror. So is that a criticism? Who knows? Right. So thank you for listening to this rant. I'll probably do another one soon. I'm hoping to get a good rhythm, but just get really busy. Anyway. Bye.